IKIM FM, inspirasi utama anda. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. And a very good afternoon to our listeners of IKIM FM. Welcome to this special interview where we dive deep into the issues that shape our world. I'm your host, Batrisha Afrina, and joining me today is my co-host, Nawar Anissa. And together we'll be exploring the complex and often controversial narratives that surround terrorism and also freedom fightings. It is a question of perspective, or is there a clear line between the two? So to help us to unpack this, I would say, sensitive topic, we are honored to be joined by Professor Khaled Beydoun, who is a leading scholar on Islamophobia, civil liberties and national security, in today's episode titled Rebel or Radical, the Dual Narratives of Terrorism and Freedom Fighting. And we'll be challenging the labels and also discussing how they are shaped by politics, history and identity. Assalamualaikum, Professor Khaled.
Yeah, wa alaikum assalam. It's great to be here.
It's great to have you here in our studio for today. So it is your first time, I was told it's your first time in Malaysia, right?
It is my first time in Malaysia. That's right.
So how do you find Malaysia so far?
Beautiful, exciting, rainy, nice people. Yeah, it's great to be here. I'm really enjoying it so far.
Alhamdulillah, it is such a pleasure to hear that. All right, so Professor, let's go directly. Let's go
dive deep.
Dive deep
Yep.
into the topic itself. Right, I was just starting of this conversation. I would like to talk about. Let's start with the point of Islamophobia. Let's define that, right? Because if you look at it merely, you look at it in dictionary, it means that the fear, hatred, and also discrimination against practitioners of Islam or the Islamic religion itself. But I think that the definition itself is not comprehensive enough. It's not grasps the reality of the terror that Muslims face from the mistreatment and also misjudgment just because of the religion. Because it's not just a matter of verbal abuse, it's not just a matter of physical abuse, it goes way beyond that, to the point that some people lose their life because of it. So I would like, as a starting of this conversation, I would like to ask your opinion. Is there any needs for us to redefine the way how we look at that, the way how we define it?
Yeah. Definitely. So I agree with your sentiment that the standing definitions of Islamophobia are not comprehensive enough. They're not thorough enough. They're not rigorous enough, which is why I wrote this academic article in 2015. Redefining Islamophobia basically as a system, as an entire sort of architecture that is tied to the war on terror and specifically tied to law and policy that is being spearheaded specifically by the United States. So Islamophobia is not just irrational bigotry, it can be rational. For instance, the war in Iraq is a classic example that, this war was entirely based on a fiction that Iraq had weapons of mass destruction. And it was an easy lie to sell because the entire American populace saw Iraqis as presumptive terrorists. And so Islamophobia is something that is very comprehensive and deserves thorough attention.
Yeah, that's quite interesting. Since you mentioned law, there's this thing called critical race theory. That is the core idea that race as a social construct.
Yes.
So, and that racism is not merely the product of individual bias or prejudice, but it's also something embedded in the legal system and policies. So, how does this theory solve the question about this dual narrative that people keep asking about policies and legal system? So do you have anything to say about
so critical race theory is central to the previous question tied to Islamophobia, because what happens in in the wake of 9/11 and this broader war on terror is that Muslims and Arabs were racialized, right? They were racially constructed in the image of terrorists.
Yes.
Yep.
Right. So you had this new redeployed idea that all Arabs, all Muslims, and part of Orientalism is the idea that Arab and Muslims are one and the same. Right. Even though one is a ethnic political identity and the other obviously is a universal religious identity. So critical race theory is central to how we should understand Islamophobia and law in general, because it racializes Muslims at large as being terrorists. And then once you have that justification, you're able to essentially enact any kind of law or policy to police and to punish and to prosecute terrorism, even beyond law, like the war in Afghanistan, state action, right? The war in Iraq, policies like the Muslim ban, which you may be aware of.
Yeah.
Counter-radicalization surveillance. So once you have a bad guy in place, once you racialize the terrorists, it's easy to pass policy to punish them.
And in recent years, CRT has become a subject of intense political debate, particularly in education. And critics argue that teaching CRT in schools, it can indoctrinate students, while supporters see it as a critical tool for understanding the historical and also the contemporary inequalities.
Yeah.
So I would like to ask you, philosophically, do you believe that it is at stake in the political debate over CRT, especially if you look at it in the regarding of the role in education, and perhaps what might the resistance to CRT reveal about the broader societal discomfort with addressing race and also inequality?
Yeah. So, good question, and I'm trying to tie it to the previous questions you just posed. So it's critical to understand, no pun intended, critical race theory.
Exactly.
That the right, conservative movements in the United States have essentially distorted what critical race theory actually means, in the same way that they distort what Islamic law and Sharia law actually mean, right? So the right wing political entities in the United States have peddled critical race theory as this boogeyman, right? And basically misrepresented critical race theory as being something that justifies racism against white people, that justifies violence, that justifies protest, that justifies promotion of LGBTQ identities.
Yes.
This is not true. All critical and I'm an expert on critical race theory. All critical race theory means is what we just discussed.
Yes.
Is the idea that race and racial identities are all politically constructed.
Socially constructed.
And socially constructed, exactly. And they're constructed for political purposes. So why was blackness constructed, for example, in the United States? Because the idea behind blackness is the founders of the country needed chattel slaves. They needed to enslave specific individuals, and blackness signified property, right? Why was terrorism racially constructed? Because it justified the American war on terror and the idea that they could bomb this country and stave war against that country, because the entire population of those countries are terrorists. Why does Israel now that we're approaching 1 year of a genocide, caricature the entire population of Gaza as Hamas terrorists? Because that enables them to engage in the kind of collective punishment / genocide that we witness right now. So there's a lot of, and look, I'm an American, unfortunately, in some respects, but Americans are very ignorant, and basically that ignorance is perpetuated by news media, which distort and misrepresent what critical race theory actually is.
To say it very bluntly. Yes.
Yeah, to say
it's
exactly.
very bluntly.
In the same ways that Americans don't know very much about Islam.
Yes.
If you were to survey and ask them questions on the street, so political elements, to be honest with you, not only the right wing but also the left, capitalize on that ignorance to push their policy.
Yeah, in recent interviews, you did mention that the left also, it's how do I say, it's kind of as scary as the right-wing movement at the moment, especially leading towards the election, right?
Oh, very much so. I mean, look, I think the left engages in its own forms of liberal Islamophobia, right? Peddling these stereotypes that, Muslims are irrational, Muslims are not tolerant of other faiths, Muslims are violent towards LGBTQ communities, all these stereotypes and tropes. And now if you look at what's happening in Israel, Kamala Harris is just as supportive of the genocidal movement and regime in Israel as the right wing, right? And even Barack Obama, who was championed as a progressive president, had droned Muslim-majority countries more than his predecessor, George W. Bush. So when it comes to Islamophobia and specifically policy in the Middle East, the Democrats are, in my opinion, just as violent as the right wing.
It's just as gun-friendly.
Yep.
Yeah.
And while I was doing research for this topic, I saw this one question. Does critical race theory say all white people are racist? Isn't that racist too?
Well, that's wrong. Critical race theory does not say that. It does not say that all white people are racist. What it essentially says is that this system of white supremacy, the idea that individuals who are white are in some way superior, is a racist construct. And we can all agree on that. Here, Malaysia, right? We're in Malaysia right now. Malaysia was once a colony of the English, right? And the English trotted into Malaysia and said, hey, we are supreme, we are civilized, we are imposing our better values onto the people of Malaysia because we are white Europeans. That is white supremacy.
As per any colonial masters.
Exactly. Any colonial master, like whether it's the French or the Spanish or the Italian, right? And so it's critical to understand that critical race theory comes from post-colonial theory. The works of people like Edward Said and Frantz Fanon and Lumumba, these people who were basically criticizing the superior impositions of Europe. Critical race theory sort of reconvey that with criticizing white supremacy. But there are many white critical race theorists. Many of them are friends and colleagues of mine. So there is not this, categorical repudiation of the idea that whites are all collectively racist. No.
But how does the West reinforces the racial construction of the terrorist and the freedom fighter?
Based on race. Look, I think that we are living in a very sort of telling time, especially when you juxtapose what's happening in Gaza or what's happening in Kashmir. Or what's happening in various parts of the world with what's happening in Ukraine, right? When the Russian invasion in Ukraine took place in March of 2023, right? What were the immediate sort of condemnations and calls in Western media legacy outlets that these are of the Ukrainian people? And look, I support any people's right to self-determination,
to live,
to live, right? And to sort of like deflect a foreign occupier or imperial force from stripping them of land and life. They were saying that Ukrainians were freedom fighters, that Ukrainians had a right to protect their land, that Ukrainians had the right to protect their families. And I'm watching the news wide-eyed. I'm like, whoa, I wish they would say these very same things for Palestinians.
I'm sure you were like, oh, that's okay.
Yeah, exactly. They were doing the same things. And there were images, for instance, where young Ukrainians in Kiev were throwing Molotov cocktails at Russian jets and tanks. Palestinians have been doing this for the longest time. And when Palestinians do it, what are they called when Palestinians do it?
Terrorists. Terrorist attack.
When Ukrainians are doing it, what are they called?
Defending themselves.
Or freedom fighters. Or heroes, right? So much of that is driven by race, because when Western audiences see Ukrainians blonde-haired, blue-eyed, white-skinned, they see themselves when they see Palestinians or Kashmiris.
That's so superficial, isn't it?
Well, part of it is superficial, but part of it is premised on the idea of racial affinity. It's far easier for you to sympathize and, in fact, empathize with people who look like you. Yeah. And I'm not sure if you guys remember, but a couple of days after the Russian invasion, there was a NBC news journalist who was reporting out of Kyiv. And he said, this is unbelievable that this is happening here. Kyiv and Ukraine are relatively civilized places. This is not Iraq or Afghanistan. And that is the message he's conveying, that war is unnatural to Europe, but it's natural to the Middle East.
It happens all the time. It happened in the 60s, in the 70s, and even way before that. But so that's what we meant earlier, that it's become somewhat normalized, and that is not okay.
And not only is it not okay, it's factually wrong. It's flat-headed. Two of the most brutal wars in modern history took place in Europe. Right? The Holocaust took place in Europe.
And the instigator himself.
Exactly. The Third Reich took place in Europe. Anti-Semitism was most violent in Europe. So in addition to it being wrong, it's actually ahistoric. It's intellectually flat-headed. Right? For Europeans to claim that war is unnatural to the West. But in the West is civilized, right? This whole discourse of Orientalism that predates Islamophobia, right? But the Middle East is perpetually war-torn, unstable, backwards, and violent.
And if you look at the way how the Muslims are being portrayed on the media, they be saying that the Palestinians fled their homes when actually they are being forcefully evicted, and it shows that it gives that connotation that the Palestinians are, I would say, like being scared of the Israelis when they are actually, they have the full heart of fighting them because they have the braveness, and it shows the perspective it has on them. And also, it's very interesting if you were to relate it into the issue of why, we, of course, the attention towards that happened in Ukraine, but then apart from that, what happened in Gaza, there's also discrimination that happened. If you look at the Asia context, for example, that happened in Muslims Uyghur, or even the Rohingya, Muslim Rohingya. It happens there, but then why the media attention, it doesn't as much as those that happen in Ukraine or other part of the countries that also facing similar, I would say, this kind of conflict.
The absurdity of it all, actually. But after 2 decades of the global war on terror, the outcome has led to a terrorism that has taken on a pointed on racial and religious form. So we keep asking ourselves, but I still have to ask this: why is this happening? After decades of global war on terror, it's still...
Because the term terrorism doesn't actually mean anything.
It doesn't mean anything.
Well, it has a technical definition of what it means, but the way in which it's been deployed is very racial in form, right? Back to this whole question of racialization and critical race theory. So it's also a question of power. The fact that the United States is the primary sponsor and the primary enabler of the war on terror, and is so sort of, keen and complicit in, flattening how the world sees Arab and Muslim identity only through the prism of terrorism. We see it not only happening all over again, but, part of the desire for me to write my last book, The New Crusades, was we see governments around the world adopting that very framework to persecute and crack down on their host Muslim communities. Places like India, for instance, which adopts the very language of the war on terror. Places like Sweden, or we see what's happening in France, which has very rife Islamophobia. So the United States, and now obviously Israel, right? When October 7th happened, when Hamas attacked, on October 7th, if you looked at Netanyahu's language, the speeches he gave right after October 7th, what was he saying? He was analogizing Hamas to ISIS, right? He was saying they hate our values, they hate civilization.
Yes.
This was the language of the war on terror that was essentially... So when we think about the United States enabling genocide, it not only enables genocide by way of weapons and finances, even more nefariously enables genocide by equipping Israel with the language of dehumanizing Arabs and Muslims, and specifically Palestinians.
The language itself, and I think it also relates to the language how it is being used in the media. And talking about the media portrayal, right, I believe that media plays a critical role in shaping the narrative around who's labeled as terrorist or a freedom fighter, like how it's been reported. So you point out in one of your article on terrorists and freedom fighters, you mentioned that you pointed out how mainstream outlets often frame certain groups in line with dominant state perspective. So what can alternative media and independent journalism do to challenge these dominant narratives, and how effective have they been in shifting public perception, especially because you are not ordinary professor of law. You have millions of followers on the Instagram. I believe because of you yourself, how you use your media, it also helps people to understand more about the issue.
Yeah, it's a good question, right? So I think for me, as an educator, it is key to educate beyond the classroom setting, especially during times like this, right? When mass audiences are curious to know what's actually taking place on the ground. And social media, digital media at large, has really opened up new possibilities for educating global audiences. The fact that this professor that teaches law in Arizona is here in Malaysia having these conversations is a testament to social media. Creating these bridges and these inroads to have these conversations. So it's been transformative in a range of ways, right? There's a wonderful quote, and I always use this quote when I talk about social media, from Chinua Achebe, a Nigerian author, wrote a book called Things Fall Apart, right? He says that until the lions have their own historians, history of the hunt will always glorify the hunter. So social media has enabled a new sort of crop of grassroots historians from places like Kashmir, from places like Lebanon, from places like Gaza. You know, people like Mu'taz and Bisan, who just won an Emmy today. You know, who would have been, she won an Emmy for her journalism. Who historically, they would have never been able to be on CNN or the BBC or Sky News, right? They're able to sort of like have Instagram lives and put up posts and put up reels. So people all around the world can see what Palestinians are experiencing in real time during the genocide. And my role as an educator is to be a bridge. Is to say, you know, because I'm equipped with the knowledge of law, I'm trained in the language of Islamophobia, to take what these grassroots historians are doing and sort of convey in a way that demystifies what Western laws are saying about us.
I think it's very telling as well that the recent attack on the Al Jazeera office at Ramallah. So it's kind of, it shows that, you know, media goes above and beyond, and so the terror attack on these people is very telling that we need to put a stop to it, because if not, then more information is going to get out. But you can't really stop the information that's going about, especially social media.
Well, you can't stop it. I think one dangerous thing, and they actually closed the Al Jazeera office, is Al Jazeera was the only mainstream news outlet that was actively reporting out of Gaza.
Yes.
And if you cut off that lifeline, you know what I mean, then you're entirely reliant on individuals on the ground. And let's not forget, they've killed, I believe the number is somewhere around 200 journalists in Gaza. Not only journalists in Gaza, but they've also killed journalists in Lebanon.
Yes.
A good friend of mine, Isam Abdullah, was killed 6 days into the genocide, a journalist for Al Mayadeen. So authoritarian governments know that in order for them to push their narrative and to push propaganda, if they can cut the lifeline of media off. But historically, it was just mainstream media. If you shut down Al Jazeera, khalas, you're done. You're good.
You're done.
But now you can't silence every individual on the ground.
Through social media.
Through social media. That's why digital media and social media is a game changer.
And then I think there's a matter of censorship here. Should we be scared of it?
Should we be scared of it? Yes, I think so. I mean, we should be scared of it for other reasons. Now they're making cell phones and pagers into bombs.
Yes.
It's very concerning to hear.
Exactly. And Siri is giving you some sorts of instruction there, someone was saying.
And also surveillance.
Surveillance
right?
as well.
So our cell phones are also systems of mobile surveillance.
How does the West-based social media, the common ones, how does that enable genocide? I mean, you mentioned in one of the talks that I've heard recently that we are watching it unfolding in front of our very eyes. Yeah. How is that okay? It's not okay.
Well, I don't think that we should view it through the lens of whether it's okay or not okay. It's not as much a normative question as it is a question around how is this impacting us as human beings from a psychological, existential, and spiritual level, right? I mean, I wrote an article called Genocide 2.0, the idea that this genocide is unprecedented in many ways, right? Because as a consequence of social media, we're seeing the genocide unfold on a real-time basis. You know, whenever a massacre happens, we're seeing it seconds later. When a mother is has her children killed, we're seeing it seconds later. So we are active participants that see genocide on a rolling real-time basis. This has not been the case. When the Holocaust was happening, people weren't knowing what the Holocaust what was taking place. When the Bosnian genocide was happening in the 90s, nobody knew what was happening. When the war in Iraq was taking place, we couldn't see the atrocities that were unfolding in real time. We are seeing everything right now in real time, right? Which has positive outcomes, but it has negative outcomes because one question that I often think about, and I'm a middle-aged man. How is it affecting a 16-year-old person? Are they becoming desensitized to violence? We're seeing a children who is limbless.
Yes.
Doesn't affect them the same way. Doesn't horrify them the same way. So the sort of existential and spiritual effects of this genocide, I think, we won't know the effects for many years to come.
Exactly. It's like because we are watching it unfold now, but the effect of it on us could be different from those who are way younger than us. But there could be two extremes as well, because in one of those interviews that I remember you mentioning that the younger ones don't have, especially in the United States, they don't have this okay, back in those days, I'm not going to say anything much about war on back in those days, they didn't really have war on terror, but they were a bit more scared and apprehensive coming out loud. But the students, the university students, you did mention that they sort of don't have that. Then I'm going to go out to the streets, man. I'm just going to go right out and say that this is wrong, and I'm going to protest about it, like what we watch happening. So, any comments on that?
Well, look, I think, to be fair, the United States, since I would say the war in Vietnam in the 60s, has always had a robust sort of culture and tradition of dissent, activism, and protest. Right? And the protests that we see right now, I think in many respects are an extension of the protests we saw during BLM, Black Lives Matter, right? The response to the violent police killing and violence towards black people in the United States. So what we're seeing now, I think, is not entirely unprecedented because it follows this, sort of established arc of activism in the United States, specifically at colleges and universities. Where it is unprecedented is tied to the issue, right? Up until recently, there was a lot of fear amongst young people to address what was happening in Palestine and what Israel was inflicting on the Palestinian people because of punitive action. Am I going to lose my job? Am I not going to get into graduate school? Is this going to stigmatize me from, having the kind of career that I want? Because the idea was, Zionists were very influential and strong in influential halls of power. That has been pierced and toppled in so many respects because of this new courage and fearlessness. But a lot of it is not only courage and fearlessness. I think it's a natural human reaction that once you see this much mass killing and this much horror and this much tragedy, that it is only natural for you to take action. I mean, as a human being, even if you were courageous and brave, if you're sitting on your phone on a day-to-day basis and you're seeing a child walking without a leg, and you're seeing 20,000 orphans, and you're seeing every college and university destroyed, and you're seeing, mothers basically being childless as a consequence of their kids being killed, that's going to drive you to action.
So, dear listeners, that is the end of part 1 of the interview series with Professor Khaled Beydoun on the topic Rebel or Radical, the Dual Narratives of Terrorism and Freedom Fighting. We hope that today's insights give you a better understanding of the complexity surrounding the matter of Islamophobia. So, if you have any questions or would like to share your thoughts on today's episode, you can do so by leaving a comment on our Facebook and YouTube, or you could just leave a message through our contest number at 011-29004004. So be sure to tune in to us next week for the second part of the interview. All this only at IKIM FM, Inspirasi Utama.